Imagine the last time you felt anxious, uncertain, or overwhelmed. What was happening? Chances are it wasn't the actual event, but the thought of what could happen. Maybe your mind was replaying a past mistake, imagining future failure, or whispering doubts about your ability to handle a challenge. That voice inside your head, the one constantly narrating your life, judging your actions, and pulling you into cycles of worry and self-doubt. What if that voice is not really you? Today you're about to discover something that has the power to transform the way you see yourself. What if I told you that the inner voice you've been listening to for years, the voice of fear, criticism, and hesitation, is just a conditioned response? What if your deepest struggles aren't coming from who you are, but rather from who you think you are? Take a moment. Listen. There's a voice in your head speaking right now. Maybe it's reacting to what you're hearing, analyzing, or questioning. But here's the most important question. Who is listening? This is a question that has fascinated great thinkers throughout history. The ancient Stoics, Buddhist monks, and modern psychologists have all explored the strange reality of human consciousness. Marcus Aurelius, one of the greatest Stoic philosophers, once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." But what does this really mean? The mind is like a river, always moving, always flowing with thoughts, emotions, and impulses. But just as the river is not the observer of its own waters, your thoughts are not the observer of themselves. You are the observer. Your thoughts come and go, but something within you remains unchanged, something deeper than any passing emotion or belief. But most people never realize this. They spend their lives completely identified with their thoughts, mistaking the voice in their head for their true self. This is why a single negative thought can ruin someone's entire day. If your mind tells you, "I'm not good enough," and you believe it, that thought shapes your emotions, your confidence, and even your actions. If your mind says, "I'm going to fail," and you accept it as truth, you start acting in ways that reinforce that belief. This phenomenon is known in psychology as cognitive fusion. It happens when we become so entangled with our thoughts that we lose the ability to see them as separate from who we are. Dr. Stephen C. Hayes, the founder of acceptance and commitment therapy, explains that the more we fuse with our thoughts, the more they dictate our emotions, behaviors, and entire perception of reality. But here's the good news: just as we can fuse with our thoughts, we can also diffuse from them. And this changes everything. Consider this: if you were sitting in a room and a radio started playing negative messages, telling you that you're not smart enough, not successful enough, not good enough, would you believe it? Would you assume that because the radio is saying these things, they must be true? Of course not. You would recognize it as just noise, and yet when our own minds play these messages, we accept them without question. Why? Because the mind is like a machine, constantly processing and generating thoughts. Many of these thoughts aren't even original. They're echoes of past experiences, voices of parents, teachers, or societal expectations. Some are fears passed down from generations. Others are simply automatic patterns created by the brain's need to predict and protect. But here's the secret: just because a thought appears, doesn't mean it's true. A Zen proverb says, "You cannot stop the waves, but you can learn to surf." This means you don't need to eliminate thoughts to be free. You only need to stop identifying with them. Freedom isn't the absence of mental noise, it's the ability to see it for what it is. So here's something to reflect on. If you are not your thoughts, then who are you? If you can hear the voice in your head, then who is listening? This is the key to unlocking a deeper truth about yourself, one that most people never realize. Think back to when you were a child, before the expectations, before the fears, before the voice in your head became so loud. Do you remember a time when you simply were without questioning yourself, without second-guessing your every move? That's because at that stage, your mind had not yet been conditioned by the world around you. But as we grow, something happens. The world starts shaping us. Parents, teachers, friends, society, all of them contribute to the voice that now speaks in your head. A child who is constantly criticized may grow up with an inner voice that says, "I'm not good enough." A child who is told to always be careful may develop a voice that constantly warns, "Don't take risks. It's not safe." These voices start as external messages, but over time they become internalized, blending into our thoughts so seamlessly that we mistake them for our own. Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, described this process as the formation of the superego, the internalized voice of authority that dictates what is acceptable and what is not. While this voice can serve a purpose in keeping us functional in society, it can also become a prison. It can trap us in cycles of self-doubt, perfectionism, and fear of failure. Carl Jung, another great psychologist, took this idea further. He believed that within each person exists both a persona, the mask we wear for the world, and a shadow, the parts of ourselves we repress. The inner voice often works to maintain the persona while suppressing the shadow. It tells us what we should and shouldn't do, who we should and shouldn't be. It makes us fearful of stepping outside the lines, of embracing our full potential, because doing so might disrupt the carefully crafted identity we've built. But what happens when you challenge this voice? What happens when you begin to recognize it not as your truth, but as conditioning? Consider this: if a parrot has been trained to repeat negative phrases, does that mean the parrot believes those words? No, it's simply repeating what it's been taught. And yet we often treat our own thoughts as absolute truths, even though many of them are nothing more than echoes of past experiences. The neuroscientist Dr. Joe Dispenza explains that the brain is like a record of the past. The thoughts you think most often create neural pathways, strengthening those patterns over time. This is why someone who has spent years thinking negative thoughts will find it difficult to break free. The brain has been wired to default to those patterns. But the good news is, just as the brain can be conditioned into limitation, it can also be reconditioned for freedom. This is where awareness becomes your greatest power. When you start to observe your thoughts instead of automatically believing them, something incredible happens. You create space between the voice and your true self. That space is the beginning of freedom. Because in that space you realize something profound. If you can see the thought, then you are not the thought. If you can hear the voice, then you are not the voice. Eckhart Tolle, the author of The Power of Now, calls this realization the awakening of consciousness. He explains that most people live their entire lives as if they're trapped inside their minds, never questioning the constant stream of thoughts that dictate their reality. But the moment you witness the mind instead of identifying with it, you step into a deeper awareness, one that is beyond thought, beyond conditioning, beyond fear. Now think about how this applies to your life. How many of your daily struggles, anxieties, and fears are actually coming from reality? And how many are simply coming from the voice in your head? How often do you stop yourself from taking action because of an imagined outcome that hasn't even happened? How much of your stress is created by thoughts about the future or the past, things that aren't even real in the present moment? Here's a challenge for you: over the next 24 hours, start paying attention to your inner dialogue. Notice the words, the tone, the patterns. Don't try to change them, just observe. You may be surprised by what you find. You may realize that much of what your mind tells you is not helpful, not necessary, and most importantly, not you. But if you are not the voice in your head, then who are you? If your thoughts are just conditioned responses, then what lies beyond them? The first step is awareness. You can't change what you don't see. Most people go through life unaware of their own mental patterns, reacting impulsively to whatever thoughts arise. But the moment you step back and observe, everything shifts. Instead of being lost in your thoughts, you become the observer of them. And when you observe without attachment, the power they once held over you begins to weaken. It's like watching a storm through a window. If you're caught in the storm, it feels chaotic, overwhelming. But the moment you take a step back and watch from a distance, you realize the storm is not you, it's just passing through. Meditation has been practiced for thousands of years by spiritual seekers, philosophers, and even modern neuroscientists for this very reason. Meditation isn't about silencing the mind, it's about seeing it clearly. When you sit in stillness and simply watch your thoughts come and go, you start to understand something profound. You are not your thoughts, you are the space in which they arise. Awareness alone is not enough. You must also learn to disidentify from the voice. Disidentification means realizing on a deep level that your thoughts have no power over you unless you choose to believe them. This is a practice that requires patience, but once you begin to experience it, the change in your life can be transformative. To disidentify from the voice in your head, you must first understand that the mind operates based on survival. Its primary function is to protect you, to make sense of the world, and to prepare you for any perceived threats. But in modern life, these perceived threats often take the form of imagined fears, anxieties, and insecurities. The mind is wired to focus on what might go wrong rather than what is going right, simply because it wants to ensure your safety. When you catch your inner voice saying, "I'm not good enough," or "I'll never succeed," understand that this is the mind's way of trying to protect you from potential disappointment or failure. It's trying to keep you in your comfort zone, where things are familiar and predictable. The mind's fear-based patterns are not personal, they're universal. Once you start seeing this clearly, you can begin to respond differently. Instead of believing every thought that arises, you can simply notice it. When your mind says, "I can't do this," you can pause and ask, "Is that really true? Or is this just my mind trying to keep me safe?" When your inner critic tells you you're going to fail, you can recognize that voice as fear speaking, not truth. This practice of questioning and observing your thoughts is known as mindfulness. It's the foundation of many spiritual and psychological traditions because it allows you to create a healthy distance between you and your mental patterns. By becoming mindful of your thoughts, you can choose which ones to engage with and which ones to let go of. But mindfulness is not about forcing positivity or ignoring negative emotions. It's about acknowledging everything that arises in your mind, whether positive or negative, without judgment. It's about realizing that you are not defined by any single thought or emotion, but rather by the awareness that perceives them. When you begin to live from this space of awareness, life becomes lighter. Instead of feeling weighed down by every thought and emotion, you start to flow with the natural rhythm of existence. Challenges and difficulties still arise, but they don't overwhelm you in the same way because you know that you are not your thoughts, you are the observer. One of the most powerful ways to cultivate this awareness is through meditation. Meditation teaches you to sit with your thoughts, without reacting to them, without trying to change them. You learn to witness the constant stream of mental chatter without getting caught up in it. Over time, this practice creates a deep sense of inner calm and clarity. But you don't have to sit in meditation for hours each day to experience this shift. You can bring mindfulness into your everyday life. The next time you're feeling anxious or stressed, pause for a moment and observe your thoughts. Ask yourself, what is my mind telling me right now? Is this thought helpful, or is it just fear speaking? By bringing awareness to your mental patterns, you can start to break free from the automatic reactions that once controlled you. Remember, the goal is not to eliminate negative thoughts, that's impossible, and trying to do so will only create more resistance. Instead, the goal is to change your relationship with those thoughts. When you see them for what they are, temporary, conditioned responses, you take away their power. Another way to disidentify from your thoughts is to use what psychologists call cognitive distancing. This involves consciously changing the language you use when thinking about your thoughts. For example, instead of saying, "I'm not good enough," you could say, "I'm having the thought that I'm not good enough." This simple shift in language creates a gap between you and the thought, making it easier to see it as just one possible interpretation, rather than an absolute truth. Over time, with practice, you'll notice that the voice in your head becomes quieter. It won't disappear completely, but it will lose its grip on you. You'll be able to hear it without reacting to it, without letting it dictate your actions or emotions. And in that space of awareness, you'll discover something extraordinary, your true self. Your true self is not defined by the mental noise or emotional turbulence you experience. It's not the persona you've built over the years, or the roles you play in society. Your true self is the quiet, peaceful awareness that exists beyond all of that. This awareness is always present, always available, even in the midst of chaos. It's the part of you that remains unchanged, no matter what's happening in your life. It's the part of you that is deeply connected to the present moment, to the here and now. When you tap into this deeper awareness, you begin to live from a place of inner peace and clarity. You're no longer ruled by the ups and downs of life, because you know that you are more than your thoughts, more than your emotions, more than your circumstances. You are the observer, the witness, the consciousness that experiences it all.